Well, firstly, just a few words about me and my organisation, just to recap what's been said there. Who are UK Payments, or the Payments Council? Well, we are the voice of the payments industry in the UK. We are a body which is owned by our members, which are the 35 largest retail financial organisations in the UK. And on their behalf, we run the main payment systems, mainly the retail payment systems, so BACS, CHAPS, direct credit, faster payments. We even check and cash payments as well. So we're engaged in the whole broad spectrum of payment services in the UK. And these statistics here really are just about our electronic payment systems. So you're talking about £70 trillion worth of transactions being processed by our systems in 2009. God knows what it was in 2010, but actually probably a smaller figure, the way things are going at the moment. As part of our mission, as well as managing these payment systems, we're also responsible for ensuring the integrity of these systems. So as you can appreciate, that's a critical part of our national infrastructure that needs to be protected. And it also means that we've been increasingly central as a coordination function to the banking industry's anti-fraud efforts. Apologies if I keep on turning back to the screen, but it doesn't actually appear on my laptop here, unfortunately. So I have to remind myself occasionally of what I'm trying to say. So again, these are our members. I'm sure you recognise a fair few of the logos there. A few more have been added recently. We've been branching out into the broader payment space. There's been a lot of new entrants of late. People like PayPal, for example, are now members of ours. Tesco have just launched a banking operation and they're in the process of joining. Mobile operators are also entering into the payment space, and they're increasingly becoming active in our space as well. So it's not just the big four banks, it's the whole spectrum of payment operations in the UK that we tend to get engaged in. And usually when a new organisation like, say, Tesco Bank comes to us, the first question they'll ask is, like, how do we offer our services securely online, and how can we learn the lessons that the rest of the banking industry has spent years in developing defensive strategies against? So let's first of all have a look at the world in which we live. Oh, look at that, I have to press each button individually. This is great. This is what happens when you convert Office 2003 file to 2010. It doesn't work. Right. So for banking then, the internet is a major service delivery channel. No surprises there. I think there are over 25 million people banking online in the UK now. That's over half the adult population, and probably the vast majority of households. About 3/4 of all households now banking online. So it's got huge penetration into the space. And obviously there are challenges, nothing new for you there. All these interactions with customers, between customers and their bank, are over what is basically an insecure interface. So the internet is not really a secure environment. The customer's equipment is not secure. The customers themselves can hardly be said to be secure either. However, banks love it. It's great, it's fast, it's cheap. Customers love it for many of the same reasons. So the challenge exists. The break point was passed many years ago, beyond which some banks say, well, if things get worse, we'll just have to abandon this whole internet experiment thingy as a lost job. But no, you have to face it now, and it's a bank without an internet channel is not a bank anymore. That's the same all over the world, not just in the UK. It's an absolutely essential service delivery channel. So the challenges of it need to be faced. So what is actually being attacked? I think it might be worthwhile spending a few seconds on that. Obviously, I think you probably spent the bulk of this day talking about how do you defend sort of internal networks against attack, things that you might be responsible for as information security professionals. The challenge that we've got is not so much attacks against the banking infrastructure, which tends to be quite well protected, and actually the attack levels against those have not been anything particularly special and have been, on the whole, massively unsuccessful. What's been happening is attacks against the end user, classically the weak point. So attackers would what their real goal is to masquerade as the legitimate user in order to gain access to the user's funds. Attacks against the bank's infrastructure is neither here nor there, not even particularly interesting to most of our attackers. So what they're really after are things like static authentication credentials, usernames, passwords, stuff that doesn't change and therefore can be said to have value in and of itself. So it's data that is worth stealing and reusing for your own purposes. And also, what's in the customer's equipment as well. So attacks against the PC and increasingly the mobile platforms, so your tablets, your mobile phones and so on, are all increasingly interesting to cybercrime attackers. So I'll look at each one of those sort of areas in turn. I'm going to start off with our old favourite phishing, or social engineering as we like to call it in technical parlance. And these attacks tend to become more sophisticated. So the original phishing emails back in 2003 was our very first one against Barclays. And that was just a randomly worded almost piece of text that happened to have Barclays misspelled in a corner. But it did get a lot of people sitting up and paying attention, thinking, oh, wow, never even thought this was possible, but here it is. Now you get nicely formatted HTML emails. You get emails which are personalized. So we saw this a few years back. So this one which has a correct first and last name, correct postal address. So they're doing a lot of data mining on individuals or targets to try and construct a more convincing social engineering message against them. You see attacks which are sort of all integrated within the body of the email itself. So most phishing attacks will just say, click on the link to take you to a fake website somewhere. This is all in one. So it's an HTML email with a built-in form, no website required. You just click the submit, and it basically all it does is it does a reply to on the email. So that's an interesting one. And it's also asking for a lot more information than you would normally need just to attack someone's bank account. So it's asking in this case for where you were born, your mother's first name, your middle name, all sorts of other additional security questions. So what the attackers are trying to do is not just the immediate attack of getting into someone's bank account in order to set up a transaction, but also to use that information, or more likely actually to resell that information onto attackers who are interested in doing a full account takeover, full identity impersonation in order to, say, take out a mortgage in someone else's name, or car insurance, or something else. So there's all sorts of reasons why someone is collecting this data. Banks are not the only targets. Increasingly in the last few years, we've seen a lot of attacks against online merchants, against internet service providers, online gaming communities, and so on. So we're starting to see the same techniques that were originally developed against banks being used elsewhere, and including HM Revenue. This is a great one, saying you got a tax refund. This one came out just a week after someone lost those two great big CDs with everybody's name on it. We see other interesting ones about HM Revenue and Customs. Obviously, this is a favourite one for the attackers to come to, including one which has we call a multi-purpose phishing email. So the hook is you're going to get a rebate from HM Revenue and Customs. And on the email it says, please click on the bank who you bank with. So it gives a list of about a dozen different financial institutions. And then depending on where you click, it'll take you to the relevant fake website. So it's like an all-in-one type of attack to try and capture everyone. We measure the growth of phishing incidents in the UK, or against the main UK bank brands. And this is the growth that we've seen over the last couple of years or so. So here, what I'm not measuring is the number of emails, because that would run into scientific notation, hundreds of millions or billions probably. But what I'm counting here is the number of incidents that banks have to respond to. What that generally translates into is the number of fake websites which have been set up on domain names which have been set up for the purpose, or more usually a hacked website somewhere that's just had a folder embedded on it with a fake banking website. So this generally, as you can see, tends to run into the thousands, and the numbers don't tend to get smaller as time goes on. In fact, last month was our record, just over 8,000 incidents against these particular financial institutions. So if you break it down by market share, as it were, per financial institution that we tend to measure, you can see the patterns tend to vary quite widely over time. And in some cases, we're not really sure that we understand why some banks get bigger or some banks get smaller, because there's not always a correlation between, say, banks being obviously weaker in security than others, or maybe it's just brand share, or maybe it's just because Bank A has suddenly launched a big marketing push, and therefore the attackers have heard about it and now they want to construct a message about it. But as you can see, numbers tend to vary quite widely over the years. Also tends to be true that where, for example, take the blue, I think that's HSBC, they had a particularly hard time towards the end of last year. But earlier in this year, they introduced new defensive strategies. So you can see that that led to a massive drop-off in how much attention the attackers were paying to their particular brand. But it didn't mean they went away. They just transferred their attacks, in this case, to Barclays and to Lloyd's Banking Group. So they don't go away, they just tend to shift their attention spans. So in terms of how the standard sort of phishing attack tends to work, well, you've got an attacker and he's got a spam bot somewhere, and he constructs a message which is nicely constructed, or often or not it's quite crude even still these days, to a number of victims. Tends to be, the usual email run tends to be, say, 500,000 to 1 million, maybe going up to about 10 million if they're particularly desperate, but there's no reason for them to go through such huge numbers. At the same time, they're using the same botnet or perhaps a different botnet in order to set up a number of phishing web hosts. And then they'll use various sort of tools in order to point people at these phishing web hosts. So usually fast flux rotation of DNS hosting. So usually meaning a bank, even if it takes down one, will have to take down a number of different sites in order to combat that particular attack. Once the victim has gone to these websites and entered into their credentials, the credentials are usually sent off to a Credential Recovery storage. Now that sounds like a really fancy term for you think might be some further hacks over another part of the world. Usually these days it's just a Yahoo email address or a Hotmail address which has been set up for the purpose, a fire and forget. I think we probably think that a good proportion of the total number of Yahoo email addresses have been set up by phishing gangs as fire and forget email addresses that just operate for a day or so and then forgotten about. They're never deactivated, they just sort of sit there on the servers for forever and ever. However it happens then, the attacker gets hold of the details, and once they've got hold of the details, well, there's a whole bunch of other things they can do with them, and I'll come on to that in a little bit. So phishing is not just straightforward. There are a number of different sort of permutations that have evolved over the last few years, one of which is what we call adaptive phishing, so fake sites which are designed to confuse or evade the attentions of investigators, because one of the first things people do, a bank investigator or more usually a third-party service provider that's working on the bank's behalf would be to, as soon as they got a wind of a site existing, we'll go to it and see what's actually there. Is it actually infringing copyright? Can I convince the domain host to take it down? And so on and so forth. So, and plus, they'll be wanting to do occasional downloads of the phishing sites to see how they work, what else they're doing. Now the attackers have learned these investigatory techniques and developed their own defensive strategies against them. So the phishing host will set up, for example, different sites depending on the localization and other factors. So if it sees you're coming in from specific IP range in the UK, it'll think, aha, that's a bank investigator looking at this. I'll give them a 404 not found message. Or depending on what browser you're coming in. So for example, if you're coming in on Firefox with a German language setting, it'll send you to a German PayPal phishing site. Or if you're coming in on Internet Explorer, English language, it will give you a NatWest banking website. Or if you're coming in on, say, text browsers, which are often used by analysts, like links and so on, then it'll give you a 404 not found. Or if you're running a browser from within a virtual machine, not typical behavior of a usual consumer, but a popular activity among security investigators, it'll try and hide the fact that the website exists at all. So you've got to be pretty canny in how you do your investigations in this instance. And it's led to, obviously, different things. For example, less use of virtual machines in investigators. So they'll set up sort of temporary PCs which are built just for the purpose and will then go in and impersonate different localizations, different browser strings and so on in order to try and mimic the behavior of a typical customer in the hope of finding what the actual website is that is intended for viewing by a victim. We're also techniques like live phishing. So most phishing, once the credentials have been harvested, usually the attacker will sit on it for a few days, a few hours, even a few weeks or even a few months before they perhaps resell it onto somebody else. What we're seeing is more growth in the use of phishing to facilitate real-time attacks. So as soon as the victim enters the credentials onto the fake site will send an instant message to the attacker, usually on their mobile phone, to say that someone's entered details into our fake site. Here are the credentials, and the attacker can then immediately try and log in. Or sometimes it will kick off a script on another botnet somewhere else that will try and log in on behalf and set up an automated payment instruction. So near real-time attacks are the new big thing in phishing. And the main target there is two-factor authentication. And two-factor authentication means that being able to sit on credentials is no longer a viable tactic for attackers. It's forced them to move into the near real-time attack strategies, and that's the only thing that will work these days. Now you might ask, why on earth is phishing still here? It's been a common, surely easily spotted attack that's been around for the best part of the last decade. Banks have spent a lot of time and money, the government and law enforcement spent a lot of time and money in educating people, don't click on a link in a weird looking email. But the fact is, it's still here because it still works. Now we run regular pieces of market research on behalf of our members, which ask, question not quite in these words, but would you act on a phishing email if you received one? And as you can see, the proportion of people doesn't tend to change over the years. In fact, if anything, you could argue it's getting worse. Not really quite sure what that is, but the number of people who perhaps would ignore it has hardened and become larger over the years. So you could say, yes, customer education has had some impact in making the bulk of people more suspicious, but there seems to be an underlying psychological attitude among a small number of people that they will always remain receptive to messages that come from apparent sources of authority. To highlight it slightly different way, I'm here from the internet, please give me all your passwords, and a certain number of people will, and attackers only need a very small number of people to actually respond and in order to make it worth their while. There's been a number of a good piece of academic research on why phishing works. And if you were to, you could do worse than reading some of these papers. Some of them have been around for quite a few years, but I think the messages in them are still very pertinent because, technology moves on, but human behavior takes a lot longer to evolve. And most of these papers look at, core human behavior patterns and some good stuff going on there. Also in the UK as well, particularly by these people at the bottom there. So well worth having a look at. Moving on now to our other biggie, malware. There's a number of big names up there at the top. Biggest of which, I guess these days, is Zeus and SpyEye. They're the ones that we're certainly seeing a lot of attention from. And the main reason why they've grown over the last few years has been the growth of multi-factor authentication for retail online banking. And that has forced the attackers to up their game quite massively. Traditional phishing attacks don't tend to work. Malware is the only real way that they've got in now. And man in the middle, nobody talks about that anymore. It's all man in the browser, things that happen actually on the customer's own equipment. And there's a lot of scripting that can go on within a piece of malware as well. So the malware has become a lot more sophisticated over the years, building complete scripting engines in order to take over the customer's session, project, say, false information, and then set up payments in near real time according to rules which are built into the software. Just to give you one highlighted example, I've seen software that will log in at the same time as the customer, give the customer a sorry, there's a problem with our bank servers at the moment, please come back in half an hour type of message, set up a payment, and then when the customer logs back in, say a day later, to find out what's going on, the malware is still active. We'll wait until the customer goes into the display bank statement function, goes into that page. We'll then spot the fraudulent transaction that it made the day before and hide it. So it'll overwrite the code. It even does clever things like you see on bank statements. Some of the alternating rows will be different shades, one grey, one blue, grey, blue. It'll even make sure that's all in the right order. So it's all clever stuff which is done. And that can be done in a fraction of a second. So I've seen one demonstrator where investigator logs in, sees a bank statement with a fraudulent transaction, and about a fraction of a second later it's gone, just like that, and it all nicely reformatted web page, hiding the fact that a transaction never took place. And the reason for that is that obviously as soon as the customer spots that something has gone wrong, then they'll contact the bank, and often that's a primary line of defense for the banks, is when the customer actually spots that something has happened. There are other defensive strategies, obviously, that banks can take place in order to spot the fact that a piece of malware is logging into a bank account rather than the valid customer, but I can't go into too many of those techniques today, sadly. So malware attacks do work, but they are very difficult to industrialize. The attacks need to happen in near real time, usually when the customer is logged in as well, because it's still reliant on the customer to enter the dynamic passcode authentication or even to fool them into setting up a transaction. So you can, as I mentioned here at the bottom, you can detect the effect of malware. Those are two fairly simple techniques, looking at get and post data, looking at weird file names and field names and so on, unusual headers. You'd be surprised actually that you think that if they'd gone to all this trouble, they would have gone to even more trouble to disguise the fact that why does it suddenly look like a customer who usually logs in from Egham in Surrey is now suddenly logging in from Kamchatka on the other side of the world, using a Russian language browser. Kind of suspicious behavior. And also the effect of, because the malware often runs scripts, then it's possible to understand what those scripts are and to break the behaviors by randomly changing aspects on the banking websites. So things that can be done. However, none of these techniques, phishing, malware, whatever, would be of any use if they couldn't get the money out. And that's where our good old friends, the money mules, come in. And these are what we call the friendly bank accounts, which the attackers need to have already set up prior to the attacks, who will be acting as recipients of the money. So they will, so they need mules, and they tend to recruit mules in a number of ways. Sometimes it's people who tend to come from where they come from. Most of the organised criminal gangs tend to come from Eastern Europe. Let's be fairly honest about this. Usually in Baltic states, Russia, Ukraine, Romania, places like that. And they will tend to get or convince migrant workers from those same countries to create bank accounts using fake credentials and then to receive a nice emolument in order to use those bank accounts, make those bank accounts available to the attackers. However, they also will convince random people to allow their bank accounts to be used in this way. One particular key target seems to be university students. Can't imagine why. So a lot of those we see emails being sent to saying, "Hi, how do you like to have easy work from home job, earn £3,000 a month? All you need to do is have a bank account at these particular financial institutions, and all you're doing is processing payments from our clients, taking it out as cash, sending it on as Western Union to our main office in Poland or somewhere." And surprisingly, it is still people are falling for this years and years afterwards, despite the number of arrests that have been made, the cautionary tales in the courts and from the police and so on. So typically we will see 50 to 150 new fake companies being set up to convince people they're actually being given a job at these particular companies. Tend to be websites, but also sometimes they'll be going a little bit deeper into it. So putting it all together then, how does this all work as a criminal workflow? Well, you've got a number of stages, collect, test, market, defraud and launder, starting with the collection phase where you've got collection of the victim's data, and they use for that phishing, malware and money mule recruitment on the other side. And then there's testing, so the bad guy wants to know, are these credentials actually valid? Do they point to a real bank account? Is the bank account actually interesting? Some gangs are only interested if the bank account has got over £3,000 in it. Others don't really care if you've just got a few hundred. Can also use the data for other purposes, so are there ID theft opportunities from the data as well. Similar thing with money mule recruitment. They want to make sure that there's no bank investigators getting in and being recruited as money mules, because that's an obvious target for them. And they will do identity checks of their own against people who they're recruiting as money mules. So a reasonably sophisticated one. And then the data will be marketed. So often the individuals who are doing these types of activities are not the ones who will be doing the end fraud. They'll be usually selling those credentials on to other gangs, although in the case of malware, it's usually a straight-through process, as it were, so it will be the same individuals. And same with money mule recruitment, they'll be building attack profiles, making sure that they're matching up victims at certain financial institutions with money mules at the same financial institutions, because that's the fastest way of getting the money out. and then they're matching up, and then they're doing the defraud. Usually it's a funds transfer, and again there's lots of fun and games and trying to understand what's the most effective way of setting up a funds transfer. And then the funds are transferred to the mule's account. The mule will then get the money out. Often that can happen surprisingly quickly. It used to be the money was sitting in the mule's account for a day or two. These days they recognise that they've got to be a lot faster about it. So oftentimes we'll see gangs sitting, the money mule is sitting or standing, as we could say, next to an ATM. They've already put their card in, they've put their PIN number in, and they've got a mobile phone in their hand, and they're waiting for the call which says actually the money is now in your account, press go, and out it comes. And that can happen remarkably quickly, within seconds. So the speed of these attacks can be extremely rapid. Once the money's out, it then needs to be laundered. The usual step is to send the money abroad, and then it goes through a number of steps around the gang where the revenues are shared between all the different participants. And then, intermediate destinations, pressures distributed, and then some of it goes into R&D, to make the next round of attacks even better. Oh joy! So as you can see, never-ending source of work for certain investigators. Anyway, so it's probably let's have a look at see what has it meant to the banking industry over the last few years. The general trend has been sort of upward, although we're starting to see, perhaps it's sort of peaked, and this year I think we'll probably start to see the first sort of, real decline in attacks. So it's been up, but we think it's coming down, and a lot of that's been down to the sort of defensive tactics and strategies that the banks have put in place, not due to any lack of effort on the bad guys' part, because if anything, they're trying harder than ever. So in terms of tactics and countermeasures, then there's a number of things which are available to banks. First one is the attitude that there is strength in depth. You shouldn't be just focusing, putting all your eggs in one basket. You should be doing a whole range of things in order to protect your systems and your customers, and eventually your brand. So the real sort of key task for banks is to identify the points of maximum risk and then to focus the bulk of your effort on those points of maximum risk. Now, for banks, that's really the point at which the transaction is being made. Because if you can cut that off or minimize the risk of that, then actually the motivation of the attackers goes way down, because it's fun to break into someone's bank account and have a rootle around, but if you can't get money out, where's the motive? And then actually that'll lead to a reduction in attacks. But a number of things we can do. So obviously there's back-end detection, service control, so putting in payment value limits, intelligent value limits, behavior monitoring and rating, transaction authentication, so making it harder for bad guys to set up a random transaction to someone that particular customer has never paid money to in the past. Let's ask them a few more questions just to make sure that it really is that customer, all the way on to stronger authentication at the front end. I'll just spend a few minutes talking about this last one, what we call the stronger front door. So I think we've seen a real move over the last few years in the UK, which says that username and password is now sort of reaching the end of its useful life, and really you've got to be moving on to more dynamic forms of authentication. And now I think, but there are a few challenges sort of to consider. So it's no good putting in, I was going to say RSA, secure ID token, but I think I won't. It's no good putting in solutions which are aimed at protecting corporate networks. Solutions which cost tens of pounds per user per year. You've got to factor in costs of millions or tens of millions of customers need to use this. Millions of those customers have several bank accounts and savings accounts and card accounts. So it's got to be really cheap. It's got to be really easy to use. It's got to be obviously secure. So no simple challenge. There are a number of solutions out there. I'm just going to talk about one in particular, which is this one, which is what we're calling, has a nappy name of EMV CAP, or Europay, MasterCard, Visa. So it's using the same chip and PIN standard, but CAP is a chip authentication program, which is designed by MasterCard, but has been licensed by Visa. So it's available on all the main card network platforms, and enables people to use their debit cards as a multi-factor authentication device in conjunction with a little reader device that looks a bit like a pocket calculator. And that's got a number of functions on it. You've got your straight one-time passcode. Put in your PIN number, it generates a pseudo-random number. Great for log-on, not for a hell of a lot else. You've got challenge and response. So the website asks you to put in a particular code. You put it in, it generates another code, and you put that back in. So you've got some assurance around two-way authentication. Or you've got what we call what we regard as the highest level of authentication, which is transaction data signing. So there you're signing data which is relevant to an individual transaction. So you want to pay this account number, this amount. You put in those two unique pieces of information into the card reader. That will generate a one-time code which is uniquely tied to that individual transaction. So if the attacker has got a man-in-the-browser attack and attempts to change any one of those pieces of information, such as the destination account number, for example, or the amount, or both, more likely, then the transaction will fail because the codes just won't match. And that's great, and that's been remarkably successful, actually. Banks that have introduced these tools have seen reductions in well over 90% in terms of the fraud that we have been facing over the last few years. So quite significant reductions. And it's had effects in other ways as well. So, for example, going back to the earlier slide, which I showed you around the proportion of phishing emails which particular bank brands face, let's have a look at see what happened when a number of bank brands introduced phishing multi-factor authentication back in 2006, 2007. So first one to do it was Barclays. Previous to that, they were target number one for phishing emails. They announced in, I think, April, May 2007 that they were going to be introducing multi-factor authentication. Almost overnight, the attackers decided to lose interest in Barclays as a brand. When Barclays made it mandatory towards the end of 2007, well, that just basically killed it off stone dead, and it's remained low ever since. The attackers sort of moved on, as you can see, from Barclays to NatWest, and I'll come along to that in a moment. But here, the green bar is Nationwide. They were declining anyway, but due to other controls which Nationwide were putting in place. But once they made multi-factor mandatory, well, it basically dropped off to almost zero, so that went away as well. And again, here, the most dramatic one, I suppose, is RBS NatWest. So they had been suffering a lot of attacks because the main attacking gangs had decided to switch their attention from Barclays to RBS NatWest. But as soon as they made multi-factor mandatory, that again had an immediate effect in dropping them off as a target of interest for phishing gangs. So, right. So I mentioned that EMV CAP is one tool which can be used by banks to introduce a multi-factor authentication solution. Clearly there are others. We did a piece of research with, about a year or two ago. We looked at what is the available landscape of multi-factor authentication solutions that are available to banks and other people who will be relying parties on them. And as you can see, the range is rather large. I didn't want to zoom in too far because I can't read that. So we looked at, tried to do a landscape analysis and just saw that the picture is huge and complex and is not getting any less so. So clearly there's a lot of attention being placed by vendors into trying to solve exactly these kinds of problems. However, most of those solutions are probably more aimed at sort of solving the problems of closed user groups, national defense sort of type of interactions, internal network access, that kind of stuff. And only a very few of these are really suitable for mass market implementations. And I think it's really only banks that have gone down that route so far. However, in the next few years, I think it will become harder and harder for other consumer-facing organisations who rely heavily on protecting the identities and the accounts that their customers have set up with them to avoid having to roll out some form of dynamic authentication solution, because it just becomes harder and harder to justify a static authentication strategy. Username and password just isn't really there anymore. However, having said that, now that two-factor has become, or increasingly becoming the norm in the banking industry, attackers have turned their attention towards saying, how can we attack two-factor authentication as well? and they've developed a number of strategies. So cryptographically, multi-factor remains extremely secure. No one's really attacking the algorithms or anything like that. They're attacking user uncertainty. So they've gone back to the usual social engineering technique of what's the weakest point in this? It's going to be the user. How can I fool the user into using the authentication solution badly or misusing it in order to derive advantage for the attacker? So let's have a quick look away at how that might work. So let's have a look at an attack that we've seen against EMV cap. So the typical transaction data signing function is, in order to make a payment, please put in the destination account number and the amount into these fields, and that will generate a passcode of that. Put it in, great, all hunky-dory. What happens if you've got a piece of malware on the victim's machine which has taken over that session and is presenting the user with false information? So once the victim has logged in using their authentication solution, the piece of malware takes over the session, sets up a payment request of its own in the background, but obviously the bank wants to know, okay, please will you user actually authenticate that? So what the malware does is represent the data that it wants back to the user as a different thing. So the user doesn't even know they're actually making a payment. It just says, thanks a lot for logging in. We've got to do an additional security check, please. Can you put these codes into your secure token reader? And then give us back the code that it generates. And when the user does that, it says, thank you very much. Thanks for completing that test. Well done. Bit of a system problem. Can you log out and then come back in and get half an hour or so? In the meantime, what the user has actually done is authenticate a transaction which is going to an attacker-controlled mule account. So it can be done, but as I mentioned before, it's a reasonably one-off sort of exercise because it needs to be done in real time, and it's proven rather difficult for attackers to industrialize. So the level of attacks remains quite low. So in terms of what the customer sees then, some of this stuff is quite sophisticated. So here's, for example, of a bank site on a user's machine which has been taken over by a piece of malware. I think in this case it was PSP2. As you can see, you've got, you can't really see, URL bar, it's green, showing it's using an EV certificate. That doesn't change at all. User sees absolutely nothing there. If you click on the certificate, it's a genuine certificate. It's just that everything on the web page is fake. So the HTML code has just been injected onto a properly certificated web page on the user's own equipment. So other malware does other things. Here's a piece of malware called Carburp. It was popular about 3 years ago. Not so much anymore, but some of the techniques are good. So you're talking about persistent storage in the browser, stuff like once the user logs in, it will get the account balance to try and find out if the account is interesting or not. It might replace, all it might do on the banking page is just replace the login button, which the customer would usually click to log in, with a malicious version that sends the user off to a fake web page. It might, as I mentioned previously, hide fraudulent transactions from the user, hide fraudulent logins from the user, amend transaction requests on the fly and hide those from the user, and insult to injury, installs a rogue antivirus application that says, you're infected with lots of virus, you need to buy this fantastic new antivirus product. In fact, that's where they make most of their money these days, is selling rogue antivirus products. So it's a very popular activity by some of these gangs. I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, the number one bad guy on the scene is Zeus, an excellent piece of software, if I may say so, very professionally produced and written. It's taken off over the last few years. We think it might be about to be replaced, but I'll come on to that in a bit. Its main target is multi-factor authentication. It uses a number of techniques like man in the browser, HTML injection, and so on. Some banks, however, try to get around this by using out-of-band customer authentication. So customers usually logging in on a PC, but will receive their authentication codes through a different channel, such as a mobile phone. So what we've seen is SMS intercept capability being built into Zeus now, what we're calling ZipMo. It's brilliant. So just to say a few, before I go into that, just say a few words about using out-of-band authentication. It's great in principle because the data is flowing over two theoretically disconnected channels that only the end user has got simultaneous access to. So that's great. But there are some practical challenges associated with it. First of all, if you're using phone or mobile phone, you've got to ensure that all your customers have actually got a compatible mobile phone and that it's switched on and in range and, and so on and so forth. And the other thing to bear in mind is that when you're doing that, sending authentication information over another channel, you're also potentially bringing that other channel owner, in this case the phone company, into play as a dependency for you. So, for example, we've seen interesting attacks like SIM swapping. Great little attack. So attackers will identify a particular victim. We've seen this happen in Australia, South Africa and Turkey, in one or two cases in the UK as well recently, saying, well, an attacker has identified a particular individual, knows that they will be receiving their authentication codes through an SMS text message, has managed through a number of attacks like going onto their Facebook page or doing dumpster diving or whatever to find out what their mobile phone number is. Then they'll go who their mobile phone operators, say in this case Vodafone. Then what they'll do is they'll go actually not to Vodafone, but they'll go to O2, into an O2 shop and say, hi, I'm this customer. I've got some information to prove that I'm that particular individual. I'd like to open buy a new mobile phone from you. And I've currently got a phone with Vodafone. It's this particular number. I'd like to move it across, please. Yes, sir. That'll be done immediately. Active within the next 30 minutes. So they're very sales-driven, the mobile phone operators, as you might imagine. In some cases, the identity checks are not as good as you might wish for. So this type of swapping activity or multi-level account takeover can and does yield some quite good results. And last but not leastly, malware on phones is now a possibility as well. So we've seen a number of attacks against particularly the Android platform, but also against BlackBerry and Symbian, and also some cases against iPhone as well. Some of them quite effective. But I'm just going to talk about this one particularly, Zeus in the mobile, or Zitmo. We've also got another version which has been designed for SpyEye, which has got the delightful name of Spitmo, but we won't give that one. So let's see how that one works. So you've got, first stage is a victim whose PC has been infected with Zeus and has been, in this case, asked to provide their mobile model and number the victim is basically presented with this web page when they log on to the internet bank saying, oh, got to check what your mobile phone is. So it checks just to make sure what the model is, what the operating system is, so it can serve up the right form of malware to that mobile number. Once the victim puts in their mobile phone number, they're then sent a text message which says you need to install a new security certificate onto your phone in order to meet the bank's new security standards, for example. They're asked to click on a link which takes them to a malware download page installed onto their PC, which then, it includes a number of things in this malware, but one of the key component is a piece of Russian legitimate spyware called SMS Monitor, which has basically been designed for people spying on their cheating spouses and all that other good stuff. And what it does is it intercepts SMSs. And it's a bit clever about it because you could even set it to monitor for SMSs which come from a specific number and then forward those on to a different phone and then wipe them from the inbox so they never actually appear in the victim's inbox. They don't know they've actually been sent a message. So it's intercepted and redirected. It also responds to commands from a command and control bot. So you can set it to look for different sources, do different actions with the codes once they've been received and so on. It can also create and delete entries in the phone book. So, for example, the bad guys can do clever things, such as set up a number that they control in your mobile phone address book and say this is the bank. So the attacker can then call you up, the victim up, and say, hi, this is my bank support calling, and it'll actually come up flashing on the screen. This is your particular bank who is calling you. So you think, oh, right, okay, I'll better answer to the questions that this man is asking me, including all my passwords, mother's maiden name, and all other good stuff. So they can be quite clever about it. We've seen a number of instances. The first one was, interestingly, a number which is registered against cable and wireless in Guernsey, but we've seen other incidents in the more recent future as well. So you might think with all that going on, what on earth are we doing to try and stop this? Well, there have been quite a number of arrests against many money mules, because they're the easiest ones to spot, but also against coders. We know quite a lot of who these particular individuals are, some of the key figures in the organised crime gangs. One of the bigger arrests happened last year. There were a number of arrests in the UK, a large number of arrests in the US, and some arrests in the Ukraine. And they're all done simultaneously as well. So it was a big coordinated law enforcement effort, which was partly coordinated through us, but also through banks in the US and elsewhere around the world. So a number of arrests, and we know that they were all connected with Zeus, because, well, we knew they were for a number of reasons, but it's worthwhile having a look and see what the impact of that was on overall Zeus activity when it happened. So here you've got a nice little website called Zeus Tracker, a nice little website I certainly encourage you to go to, because it's a good measurement tool for what's going on in the world of malware. They also run a parallel website called Spy Eye Tracker as well. So you can see the activity of various domains and configs that are being used by Zeus. And here are the arrests in the UK, the ones in the US, and the ones in the Ukraine. And you see an immediate drop-off in activity there, which lasted for a good few weeks, and then suddenly went back again. And we think that's because certain individuals were bailed, and then thought, well, let's get back to work. And there you go. That was good fun. But then they received long jail arrests, jail sentences. So as time went on, the activity dropped off. And indeed, that did have a big long-term impact on Zeus as a piece of malware. I think the attackers woke up to the fact that actually, people, investigators really understood, and law enforcement were really on their case. They knew who they were largely. They were tracking them down. So what happened was a bit of argy-bargy behind the scenes. Basically, Zeus was sold off to the guy who ran Spy Eye, and the piece of malware was bound together into one big kit. And we think the Zeus gang moved on to the next big thing. We'll have to see what it is. But there are other things which are happening in the good old malware world, including malware as a service. Is certainly something that we've seen emerge over the last year or so. So the guys who write the malware won't necessarily do anything nefarious directly with it themselves. They'll be selling it as a service to other gangs and configuring it. And here's a panel of the black hole malware injection kit, where they've sold it as a service to a number of individuals and gangs, and they've got a control panel themselves which allows them to service their clients, make sure the configs are up to date, and they've got bug patching and everything else already installed in there. And you've got the emergence of good old point-and-click malware kits. Here's one to Java, build it yourself, Java drive-by generator. So three easy stages and create, and there you're done. Load it onto your hacked website, and you've got an immediate drive-by download set up for anyone who visits that site to run. If they're not properly protected, will run that piece of Java and then do other things like install a bot onto the machine or whatever. So it can be quite good. So lots of reading, as you might expect, for people to follow up if you're interested in the whole great world of malware. There's some excellent blogs as well. So Malware Intelligence blog is really good. If you want to get hold of samples, that's a good place to start. Good organizations in this are people like Trust Defender, FSecure, really great. Brian Krebs, the man who knows too much, is a good place to start. And Gary Warner knows an awful lot as well in this space. So good sources of intel to go and see what's new in the great world of malware. But as you've seen behind there in the last few slides, when we think about malware, we tend to think about what are the vulnerabilities on Windows, because that's what the guys are really attacking, isn't it? It's the underlying operating system. Well, actually, not so much. Well, yes, obviously, but increasingly not so much the underlying operating system itself. One thing I will say from Microsoft is that they have done a reasonably good job of making sure that their patching system is really effective. We're looking at over 90% of Windows installs being actually up to date, and that's not a bad thing. However, where we're really let down is the third-party software that runs on top, and particularly the ubiquitous stuff, particularly things which are made by Adobe systems, Flash, Acrobat, all that really good stuff. Most of those are not up to date or patched, and the patching systems there are they need to be improved. And it's not, I don't want to pick on just Adobe because there are other things, but fair to say that Flash is present on more boxes than there are Windows boxes. It runs on a number of different operating systems, and some of those vulnerabilities carry over to those different operating systems as well. So, and it's great it can't get access to the master boot record, but who cares? Because all an attacker really wants is to be able to take over a browsing session or get stuff which runs in the app layer. So they don't really care about reformatting your hard drive or whatever, or installing a rootkit. They just want to be able to get money out of a victim. And sometimes software which you think is trusted or should be trusted often isn't. We're seeing that a lot of that in the mobile app space. Some of the most popular games on the iPhone platform are doing weird stuff like sending phone numbers to databases or doing other things as well. And on the Android platform, particularly, you start installing some stuff which says game software. So why does it need to know my GPS location and be able to make phone calls and all this other good stuff? You think, should I really be installing this? I don't know. But at least Android sort of makes some effort to tell you what the application can do. And banks are not really the only fruit. And as we've seen, banks have been engaged in an escalating sort of arms race. And as the attackers have got quicker and better, so the banks have also upped their game as well. However, what we're seeing increasingly is that attackers themselves are beginning to turn their attentions to weaker targets. So it's not just banks anymore. Any bank which transacts online is at risk. And to some extent, you can see the effect of that in the growth of PCI DSS as a standard, but it's not just those organizations who need to take account of it. They should be really paying close attention to how secure their customer-facing elements of their operations are. So, retailers are being attacked quite a lot as well, not just to get hold of credit card data, but to do other things as well, such as identity theft. So I'll round off for that one. So saying, there are a number of different avenues by which people are being attacked. A number of ways into systems. So don't just think it takes account of social engineering or malware. That's a great one. I think. I wonder if anyone's actually tried that. Trying to do a SQL injection overflow onto a speed camera, but then wipe it. Wouldn't recommend it. There you go. So there are a number of ways into computer systems. There are a number of ways in which you can be attacked. And as businesses tend to become more customer-facing and using the internet to do a lot more of their business, then the sort of surface area for attack is just increasing and increasing and increasing. And large parts of that surface area are inherently quite insecure. There are a lot of things you can do internally to protect your own networks. But what happens when you've got to pay attention to what's actually on your customer's own PCs? Because, you could say, well, that's tough luck if my customer's been hacked and they've lost some money. But at the end of the day, if that becomes an endemic issue, then it's going to harm you, your business, and your operation, and your reputation in the marketplace. And as we've seen, things operate faster and faster where the internet is concerned. We've seen some organisations having their reputations destroyed almost overnight. Look at Sony, for example. They had some massive attacks. I think they've only just hired a cybersecurity head, haven't they? I think that's what I've seen in the last few months, which is quite amazing, I find. But at least it forces them to pay attention. Sadly, they had to lose a few $100 million worth of revenue in order to convince them that that's a really good idea. Banks are already in that space, so already doing a lot of that work. It's everybody else that I think has got to be worried from now on. So with that encouraging message, I'd like to round off, say thank you very much, and happy to take any questions. Thanks a lot.